everybody. What this is supposed to be a talk about making meadows, but it's an enormous kind of subject. So I'm not going to try to sort of give anybody the feeling, oh, I know exactly how to do it, I can go off and do it now. It's more to sort of give you a kind of overview, whet your appetite, and get you thinking, and actually get you looking, even in the wintertime, get you looking at grassland, because there's so much you can learn from it, which is relevant to meadows. The first picture we've got up, those of you know anything about meadows will have probably heard the term cornfield annual meadows. Now, that's actually a very strange expression, because cornfield annuals, which are the plants that used to grow in the corn crops before the use of herbicides, etc. The poppies, and there's a few red poppies there, aren't there? And there's, what else have we got? The yellow corn marigolds. We've got one pink corn cockle. We've got a couple of blue cornflowers, and we may have the daisies are probably something called corn chamomile. Now, the thing, all of these plants are annuals. That is, they're short-lived plants. A meadow doesn't mainly consist of short-lived plants. It consists of largely of long-lived plants. These plants grew in the cornfields every year because every year the cornfield was ploughed up and they got a fresh start. There were loads of their seeds scattered in the ground and they could come up again. But if the field hadn't been ploughed, then they wouldn't really have been back. There were perhaps a few the following year. If the field had just been left, there'd be a few the following year, and the year after that, probably none, because plants that grew more slowly but grew more steadily, if you like, and had stronger root systems would outcompete them. So people often say, oh, I sowed a load of poppies last year and they haven't come up this year, and that's not at all surprising. But what a meadow actually was traditionally, it wasn't something that people did. They didn't make meadows because meadows were nice and we liked to look at them and they were good for wildlife. Farmers made them for very, very practical reasons under the old farming system. They made them fundamentally in order to get a crop of hay from them, which they needed as a winter feed for their animals. So the meadow was the same piece of ground year after year, and the way that it was managed is that after the hay cut, which took place in June, July, or August, probably most often in July, after the hay cut, what typically happened was that grazing animals were put out on the meadow, and they grazed away at it until autumn, possibly right through the winter. If the ground, a lot of ground, if you've got animals on it in the winter, it gets into a real state. It gets muddy and sticky, and lots of things are destroyed. So if you had that kind of land, you had to take the animals off around about October or early November. But if you had sort of land that didn't get mucky, you could leave them till February. But what you did then is you totally excluded animals from the field until you cut the hay. So the plants hadn't been destroyed by the grazing of the animals, and in many ways the animals had benefited them, but they grew and they flowered, and in due course the hay was cut and the cycle started all over again. So that's what meadows were traditionally. Artificial fertilizer, etc., really paid to them very dramatically during the 1950s mainly. But what happens for their beauty and their wildflowers, etc. Now, meadows can exist or be made anywhere, but as we focus very largely on meadow making in the inner city, with special reference to Tower Hamlets. So right, so so a cornfield, that's a cornfield annual meadow is a bit of a contradiction in terms, really. But we can move on. What can we do? We move on to the next slide now. Right, now, the basis of all meadows, except cornfield annual meadows, are grasses, not just grass as such, but there are three grasses here, which are, you know, they're not showing the whole grass, they're showing actually the flowers of the grass. And you've got on the left, you've got the cocksfoot grass, and you've got the strangely named Timothy grass in the middle. And you, on the right, you've got a grass called sheep's fescue, which grows in drier, less fertile places than the others. And is, you know, it's what they call a fine-leaved grass. The leaves are very thin, and sheep's fescue tends to grow quite slowly. It doesn't grow as fast as the others. But the meadow, you know, the basis of any meadow, many of the things grow in the meadow. Many of the flowers that grow in the meadow, they actually need to grow in grass, and the grass actually also keeps out the competition of go together. You know, they're inseparable. All of these I've got a little thing flashing up. My internet connection is unstable, so I hope nothing goes wrong. All of these are perennial grasses. That is, they flower. Usually, most grasses flower in June. They go through an annual cycle, and they're perennials. They go on from year after year. There are lots of grasses which are what we call annual grasses. If you're a gardener, you'll have met some of those. And like annual wildflowers, they sort of don't have much of a root system, and they grow from seed, and they flower and seed again quite quickly in a year or less, and then they die, and they have to start again from new seeds. So right. Let me just glance at my notes for a moment to remind me. One of the key things an absolutely fundamental things about meadow is that if you've got very highly fertile soil, it's virtually impossible to get a successful meadow going, because the grasses will tend to grow so strongly, as will perhaps plants like nettle and dock. Given the chance, the grasses will tend to grow so strongly that the wildflowers simply can't compete with them. So you need, for meadow, you either need the fertility to be not really high, to be moderate or low, and if the ground you're starting with is highly fertile, you have to do something about it. So that's nevertheless, the grasses are still fundamental. A couple of other things about grass is that grasses have, first of all, in summer drought, grassy areas often look dead. They're not dead, because what grasses basically do is to cope with the drought, they kill off their leaves so they don't lose moisture, but they don't kill off their roots. And so as soon as the rain starts again, you will have noticed that the grass greens up within a week or so, very, very quickly. It looked dead, but it wasn't dead. The general cycle of grass growth is to sort of pretty much stop during the winter, from about November through to middle of March. There is some growth, but it's quite weak. And once it starts in the spring, growth is very, very strong in April and May, and flowering of most things happens in June. And from then on, grass still grows, but it doesn't grow as strongly. And that's actually, it's quite important to understand that, because one of the things, if you start a meadow in spring, you may have a problem in the sense that your grasses are growing so strongly that your wildflowers don't make it. Right, we can move on to the next slide. Right, we've got three. What we can do with a lot of this is work through particular plants that naturally grow in grassland, but that have got different strategies for doing it. I don't know how many of these people know. The middle one, the red dead nettle, will be the best known one, but the one on the left is called Burr Sherville, and the one on the right is called spotted medic. It's called spotted because the leaves, you can see each little leaflet, each part of the leaves have three parts like a clover, and each leaf has a spot in the middle. Sometimes that spot is strong like these, sometimes it's quite faint, and occasionally it's missing altogether. But there are little yellow flowers in spotted medic, which you can just see there, little yellow pea flowers. But these three plants, they're what's called winter annuals. They basically grow. They start to grow in the autumn, about September, October. They grow through the winter, and they finish their life cycle in the spring. They finish their life cycle by producing seeds and then dying off. And those seeds sit there until the next autumn, and then they start again. So quite a lot of grass, especially in the cities, in tower hamlets, you'll find these plants very commonly on all kinds of grass, including, grass which is regularly mown, amenity grass. You'll find them because in general, that grass doesn't get mown between middle of November and the middle of March. So they get a chance. They get a chance to grow, and they grow quickly, and they produce their seeds. And when the mower does come along in the spring, it does actually destroy some of their seeds, but a lot of them are produced quite low down on the plant, and enough seeds from these plants survive to start the cycle again next year. So that's an example of how some plants fit into coexisting with grass, and really need the grass to. I've not seen spotted medic ever growing away from grass. Red dead nettle, yes. Burr Sherville, I haven't seen growing away from grass either. So these are three plants, and if you're looking around during the winter and spring, you'll spot these. That at the moment, the spotted medic which is very common in our area, and it hasn't got flowers, but it has got the leaves, and it's nice to just walk through a piece of grass looking to see if you can see these things. So we'll move on to the next one now. Right. Now, here are three more plants that will be probably, all of these will be familiar to everybody, and they are very frequently found in grass, and they're also found in grass which isn't. They're found in grass which isn't a meadow; it's just amenity grass, and what I want to talk about is how it is that they can thrive in that environment, despite the fact that the mower comes along very frequently from March to November. One of the things, the key thing about them is that all of them have, especially when they're mown, they have most of their leaves very low to the ground, which means that the mower passes over it doesn't pass over all of their leaves, but it passes over most of them, and they can survive. Now, the dandelion and the daisy have another trick, and you know, the daisy is perfectly adapted to grass which is regularly mown, and the dandelion is pretty well adapted. What their trick is that they flower very quickly after the grass has been cut, because they've already got buds down at ground level, and you can often see fresh daisies within 2 or 3 days of the mowing. They may only have 2 or 3 weeks before the next mow, but both for daisies and dandelions, they've got it. That's enough time for them to produce and ripen seeds, and so keep them going. And they actually benefit from the mowing, because you don't see, you know, when you see grass which is not regularly cut, you see very few dandelions and you don't see any daisies. That's because they can't grow tall, and if they're in tall grass, they don't get enough light to grow, so they die out. So they've got tricks to grow in grass. The one in the middle, yarrow, is a summer flowering plant, and it'll grow. People often think yarrow is a fern because the little leaves, finely divided leaves, look fern-like. But often when you walk across mown grass, if you know what to look for, you can often see the carpets of yarrow leaves low down on the ground, and they can persist there indefinitely, no matter how often they're mown. And when they get a chance, they can put up flower heads. Those flower heads take longer to develop and longer to ripen seeds than daisies and dandelions. So sometimes, you know, the yarrow never gets a chance to flower, but it can just stay there. So there's another lot. So we move on to the next slide. Right, here are 3 more plants that you may find in. You may find them in a meadow. You may find them, but you can also find them in amenity grass. Don't know whether everybody knows all of these, but Germander speedwell, its trick is to be having practically flat to the ground, so the mower goes over them. It's unlike daisy, which can flower all the year round. It flowers basically in late April and May. So if you know the beautiful little flowers, and you'll obviously find them in places other than meadow grass, but if you're looking for things and you learn to recognize those little leaves, you can find out where the Germander speedwell is growing. We'll go to on the right. We've got sweet violet. Now, sweet violet is amazingly adapted to mown grass. It is very common in Tower Hamlets. People don't always realise this, because sometimes it never gets a chance to flower because the mower comes along. But there are quite a lot of grassy areas on housing estates and in parks where in March and April you might literally see sheets of sweet violet flowers. They only flower in the, well, it's not quite true, but basically you only see them flowering in the spring. But what happens to them is that their leaves, when they're mown, they keep enough leaves to keep going, and they actually they've got other tricks. Their seed heads are formed quite low down on the ground, and they actually don't get ripe until late summer, but they're so low down that the mower goes over the top of them, and when they eventually do release their seeds, new plants can form. So sweet violet can spread both by the patch getting bigger and by new plants coming from seed. And one final trick is that the sweet violet seeds have a little bit of a body. On them.
Terry?
and perhaps take them back to the nest, or
Sorry, everyone. I think Terry's having some connection
the
issues.
ants actually spread the seed. In the middle, we've got lady smock. I don't know whether everybody knows that, but this is a plant which I know one or two places in Tower Hamlets where that's just growing on municipal grass without any care being taken of it. And it's a plant that's low down on the ground all the year round, except in the spring, except in April when it shoots up these lovely flowers. It tends to like the grass to be a bit damper than the average piece of grass, but you can find it and you can encourage it. So we'll move on to the next one. Right, I've got here a slide of two kinds of closely related plants which will grow in grass and can grow in a meadow. Primrose on the left. Oh, that's our, if you can hear something, it's our clock.
I was going to say, have you actually got an owl outside your window?
No, I'm afraid not. At least
that's incredible.
You're not here at cuckoo time. That's
a great clock.
Yeah. Anyway, it comes from the RSPB, if I can throw in a free ad. But you can see Primrose and Cowslip. Primrose flowers come singly. Cowslips come on a head which stands quite well up. After seeding, and you can actually see that on the picture of the left, the seed head bends down towards the ground and the seed is produced close to the ground. So that would mean that even if you came along and cut the grass after flowering, some of the seeds might get through, but even if they don't, those plants go on from year to year and they get bigger of their own accord, even if there are no new plants from seed. So people often think of these as quite classic meadow plants, but primroses tend to, like lady smock, primroses like a bit more dampness than cowslips, and they also will grow in more shade. They like a sort of in between sunny and shady, ideally, whereas cowslips mainly grow right out in the open and they can put up with very dry conditions. But the two will often grow nearby one another, and where they do, they'll actually literally overlap. You know, some of the primroses will go into the slightly shady bits, into the sunny bits, and some of the cowslips will go into the shady bits. So primrose and cowslips, lovely things to have in a meadow, and they will tolerate it, even if you then, after they've flowered, if the mower starts to come in for the rest of the summer, they can survive it because they have leaves which are right low, flat on the ground. So it doesn't do them any good, but they can survive and come back next year. So where are we? Yep, we'll have the next one now, and right. And now this one, I put this in. I had a talk a couple of weeks ago about bulbs, but what we've got here is, a lot of spring bulbs in grass. We've got some daffodils, daffodils and crocuses, that's a mixture. But the reason I've reintroduced bulbs again is that bulbs in grass are much more straightforward to encourage than a meadow. They're really almost foolproof. If you plant bulbs, you can be pretty confident that they will grow and that they will come back year after year. And that means that, if you're thinking, I want to make I've got my eye on somewhere on my housing estate or something, and I'm keen to make a meadow, but maybe it won't work. Maybe people won't like it. And it can be quite a good idea to start with bulbs, basically, because if you start with bulbs, people will respond to it, and your landlord will think, oh, that was good, that was successful. Maybe we'll let them try something else. So bulbs can be kind of ambassadors for meadows, but if you have them, what you can't do, they can't be mown between really November and the end of May or early June. They can't be mown because they've got their leaves up. When they haven't got the flowers, they've got their leaves. And if you cut their leaves off when they're in full growth, that will weaken the bulb. It can't build up its strength for the next year's flowering. So, but what that does, so bulb grass has to be left for longer, and gardeners are quite used to doing that. But what you'll find if you look at, if next spring you look at areas where there are bulbs in the grass, you'll find that there are a lot of other plants in the grass, and the bulbs actually give some of the, like buttercups are a great example. If there are buttercups in there, they'll get a chance to flower and flower properly. Whereas if they start cutting in the middle of March, they won't. So many plants can hitch a ride on the, with the bulbs. So, and you can also, if you're looking at an area and you're thinking, what happens here when it's not cut for a while, you get a chance to see what is going on, whether you've got daisies, dandelions, what other things you might have. There are a lot of things you can have. So you get a chance to assess your grass. Right now, I think I want to say a few things. One of the things about making a meadow in the city is that generally you're not a completely free agent. You're not saying, well, I own this piece of land, so I can do what I like with it. The land you've got your eye on is most likely to be in a public park or on a housing estate. It may well be somewhere else if you're lucky, but what you have to do, you may have to persuade quite a lot of other people to go along with you if you want to try and make a meadow. And bulbs are a great way to start. When you'd ask the landlord permission to put the bulbs in, and you'd consult about where you put them, because you don't want to put them in such a way that you make the mowing regime for the rest of the grass much more complicated. And you put them in a tightly defined area. You don't just scatter one here and one there all across the area. You put them in so that that area cannot be mown and the rest of it can. And you make quite sure that your bulb area really stands out, because men with mowers, if they see a bit of a gap where there don't seem to be any bulbs, in they go with the mower. So but if you want to do something in the park, our local parks department now has moved a long way, and they will they'll welcome and engage with you and discuss your idea, or you can come through us, the friends, because we have good contacts with them. But they will, they want their parks to develop more wildflower grassland and bulb areas. If you're on a social landlord's estate, it may be different, because there are many different landlords, and your circumstances may depend on who your landlord is. But what you have to do with anything, you have to convince the powers that be that whatever you want to do, whether it's just bulbs or whether it's a meadow, you've got to convince them that it's a good idea and you can do it. You may also have to, you've got to, if you have a tenants and residents association, you've got to persuade them. Even if you can persuade the landlord, sometimes you can't necessarily persuade the tenants and residents association, or the other way around. It's also a good idea to make contact with the people who mow the grass, and so that they know and sympathise with what you're doing. And it's also, you also want the general support of residents on the estate, not just to to like what you're doing, but to help you do it. So you've got kind of politics involved in a city meadow, and I think spring bulbs are one of the best tools for, you know, for that politics. Right, now what next? We'll keep it on there for a minute. What I want to talk about now, what I haven't talked about, is how to, what's the time? How to, about making meadows. Now, I can't go fully into that, but what there are actually a lot of different ways to make a meadow. Some of them are quite drastic, and the cost of them will vary enormously. One of the most drastic ways to make a meadow, and people do this sometimes when they know that the soil is too fertile, they actually strip off the topsoil, and if they're on a big estate, what they may do with it is mound it up somewhere else, make a new feature away from the meadow. Or if they're very lucky and the soil is really good, they might even be able to profit from making a meadow by selling the topsoil on a large scale, provided that you know, big machinery can get in there to do it. But that's not generally a solution. That's not generally something you can do in the inner city. But that's one way to do it. Another way to do it is to simply weed kill all existing plants on the site, and you may have to apply weed killer several times, because there'll be lots and lots of seeds in the soil, and you can weed kill once and there's no plants growing, but another crop comes up. So sometimes people who've done that have weed killed about 4 or 5 times, which is not something most people would really want to do, but that is a way to get your blank sheet to make a meadow. In the ways which are less drastic are I think I can give you 3 ways which are not very drastic and they're not very expensive. The least drastic of all is to, and can't give much detail on this. The least drastic of all is simply to buy wildflower seeds of the many types which will actually tolerate mowing, and that there is a great many that will tolerate mowing. Although if they're in grass which is regularly mown, they won't flower, but they will grow, and you'll be able to see they're there by recognizing their leaves. So I've done this where on the estate where I live years ago, I put down seed of plants like lady's bedstraw and bird's foot trefoil and oxeye daisy and knapweed, all of which can tolerate being mown indefinitely, but they don't flower, obviously. And they've sort of really spread, and they've been there for about 10 years now, and they've patched out. They still seldom get a chance to flower because of the mowing that takes place all the time, but it can be done. So you could almost start a meadow that way, and then eventually you'd know that once you stopped cutting it, you've got the meadow flowers there already, and you'd have the result coming up, and that would give you an absolute head start. But possibly another way of doing it, which would be very good, is in autumn, and in fact, somebody I know is going to be doing this coming Saturday. In autumn, get the grass cut as hard as it can possibly be cut, on the lowest possible cut, and then do what they call scarifying it. That is raking it, or there is machinery that can be used. But otherwise, what you do, you rake it and you try to create a lot of bare ground, maybe as much as half the ground with no plants on it, and then you sow your seed. And by far the best time to do that is autumn. Another way of making the meadow that we've done ourselves and we know it works is to do what they call top dressing. If you feel the basic conditions are okay, you spread a layer of about 5 centimeters of sand or crushed concrete on the area you want to turn into a meadow, and you sow your seeds on top of that. What happens then is that those seeds, because you've temporarily suppressed what's growing underneath, that those seeds get a chance to get going. And what will also happen is that because you've only put on about 5 centimeters of material, a lot of the plants and grasses that are underneath will gradually come back up through. So that can work. That can work very well, and it's relatively simple. I mean, there are other ways to make meadows, but I won't go into them now. So what will I do? We'll move on to the next slide. Right, and watch the time here. Just going back again to plants, got 2 plants here. We've got yellow rattle, which anyone who's read anything about meadows will have heard a lot about, because yellow rattle is a semi-parasitic plant. It has roots which tap into the roots of other plants, especially grasses, and they take from those grasses. They take water and they take minerals, and that weakens the grass. What they do with their own green leaves is make their own sugars. They don't take the sugars from the plants they parasitize. But yellow rattle is a nice plant in its own right. It's an annual, and what it does is not reliably, but it's well worth trying. It is weaken grasses, and then gives other plants which are not grasses a better chance of getting established. The other thing on the right is not a plant for a meadow. It's an ivy broom rape. But it's an example of a completely parasitic plant which gets everything from ivy by tapping into the roots of the ivy. It gets absolutely everything. It has no leaves, it has no greenness, and the only time it comes above ground is to flower. So in many ways it's a bit like a fungus, but it obviously isn't. So that's a fully parasitic plant as opposed to yellow rattle. So yellow rattle is one of the tools for your meadow, and you don't have to do it only when you start a meadow. If you've already got a meadow or grassland, you have to simply scatter yellow rattle seed in there, and you have to do it before the end of November. If you do it any later, it won't come up the following summer. So we'll move on to the next one. Right. Here are, I better watch the time because we've only got about, 15, 20 minutes left, Michelle? Actually. Anyway, yeah. I'll watch the time and truncate things a bit. Here are 3 classic lovely meadow flowers, all of which are totally mowing tolerant. So, and they may exist in grass which is already amenity grass, if they somehow or other got there, but they can certainly all be sown, and then you can carry on happily mowing until you're ready to stop the mowing. Right, move on to the next one. Right, here are 3 more plants. 2, they're all related. They're all in the Pea family, and they're all very good, lovely plants of high wildlife value, very good for pollinators, all of them. The birdsfoot trefoil and the white clover can be mown indefinitely. The red clover can't. The red clover grows taller than the others, so if you keep mowing it, it doesn't really get a chance to, you keep taking off that growth, so it keeps pushing up. So you can probably mow it certainly twice in a year and keep it, possibly 3 times, but you can't mow it indefinitely. So we'll move on. Right, another couple of classic meadow flowers, Fieldscabius and Meadowcrainsville, but both, lovely plants, but they can't, again, you in general you wouldn't mow those at all during the growing season, but you'd probably get away if you mowed once. You might get away with it, but in general you wouldn't do so unless you couldn't avoid it. So we'll move on. Right, here we've got more flowers. We've got common mallow, which is a plant you'll find everywhere in the built-up area. It is quite a big, tall, untidy plant. Gardeners often don't dislike it, but it's a good plant. It's good for wildlife. It's attractive. It's got a more delicate relative called musk mallow, which is a classic meadow flower. That's in the middle. And there's a little one on the right, which I don't know whether everyone's got there. Can't see the whole thing because of I've got pictures of people there. But that's a little mallow which creeps on the ground. Now, on mown grass, you'll often find the dwarf mallow because it's very low and it escapes the mower. And the common mallow, sometimes you'll find it creeping flat along the ground because some plants are prostrate. They don't grow up at all. They just creep along the ground, and mown grass tends to favour them because they survive that, whereas the ordinary mallow keeps growing up and keeps getting cut off and doesn't do as well. We'll move on. Right, here we have 3 plants which can be grown in a meadow, which can form quite large patches. They'll form patches. Soapwort can form because the roots creep. It can form very big patches, meters square. Rosebay willow herb can form enormous patches. Sometimes whole hillsides are covered with it. Tansy on the right forms very tight patches. It spreads, but it spreads, very thickly rather than loosely. We've discovered something about Rosebay willow herb, which is really interesting because it doesn't grow tightly. It grows a flower stem, and there's not another one for perhaps 8 or 10 centimeters. So there's lots of space in between the stems, and it also doesn't really start to get going until May. So what we find is that all kinds of flowers, spring flowers like cowslips, primroses, celandines, daffodils, crocuses, they thrive very well in the patch of Rosebay willow herb because there's really, when they flower, the rosebay's not up, and when it does come up, it still leaves them with a certain amount of light to finish their life cycle. And you also find that climbing plants like everlasting sweet pea and tufted vetch can actually live in the willow herb in summer and grow up among it. So it's quite remarkable, really. And establishing a patch of willow herb, which any of these would be best established from plants. I wouldn't try establishing them from seed. Just get pieces of plants and stick them where you want them. Move on. This is the last of the slides, and it shows a couple. You'll see on mown grassland, when it's not been mown for a while, you'll often see lots and lots of yellow dandelion type flowers. And these are just 2 of them. I think there's cat's ear, which is quite tall, but its leaves are all at the bottom. As you can see, the leaves are all at the bottom, so they survive the mowing. And once the mower's gone, they pretty quickly get to produce more flowers. And so these you will find sometimes absolutely carpeting amenity grass, but you need to look at them in the morning because they tend to close up in the afternoon. So you think, they're not, where have they gone? So those are 2 things that by and large totally look after themselves, and their seeds are wind blown, so they get around, the difficulty with some of the other meadow flowers is if the seeds are not windblown or taken by birds, they may never get to a place where they could grow very well. I think what I haven't covered, and I think I'll leave it now, is that when you've got a meadow, there are different ways to manage it. You basically manage it by cutting, and certainly in general, you should have it cut once a year in autumn, when a lot of the flowers, they'll take that because they've died down, but they've died down for the winter. They'll take mowing, but you can mow at other times as well. And if you've got bulbs in the grass, one option is to mow after the bulbs are finished and then mow again in the autumn. And you'll get, your meadow then will be rather fresher than in the later summer. It will be a fresher meadow than if you hadn't mown at all. And it'll be different as well, because some plants will be fine with that regime, others won't like it as much. So I think I better stop there.